Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome back Kim Grant, who is going to be talking about her new book, which is doing very well by all accounts, From Shooting to Creating. This live webinar is being streamed to YouTube. I can confirm that's working, as was the last one, surprisingly. If you've been to these before, you'll know that the discussion it will be from Kim or Kim's talk will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. That would be great. And also, we must give a shout out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust and Arts Council England. So without further ado, let's hand over to Kim.
Thank you, Steve. I will just share my screen with you all and we will begin. So firstly, it's a real privilege to be invited back to speak with a company of makers. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you who've joined us this evening, whether you were at the last talk or not. It's lovely to have you here and for you to spend the time with us this evening. As Steve said, I'm going to be speaking to you today about my new book, From Shooting to Creating, How Changing Your Language Can Transform Your Photography. And while the talk is about the book, it's mostly also about sharing some of the teachings of the books and some of my discoveries with you so that it can give you some food for thought on your own, both photographic journey as well as your life journey as well. So just to set the scene, I'm just going to go back a little bit to the beginning of my photography journey because it plays in very nicely with my decision to progressing into creating the book. So I began my photography journey when I was 16 years old. At the time, I was struggling quite significantly with my mental and emotional health. And during the midst of quite challenging times, I would go down to my local beach, which was fortunately only a 10-minute walk from my house, and I would watch the sunset. And I found when I watched the sunset that it was one of the only times when I ever felt any real emotion and any real more positive and uplifting emotions. And this inspired me to begin my photography journey. I wanted to start photographing the beautiful scenes that I was seeing around me and connect with them more deeply. And since then, my journey through photography has grown and evolved in so many ways and has led me to where I am today. The real important thing I discovered when I began photography was the emotions that it made me feel. So when I was out photographing, particularly these sunsets, I would feel a lot of things like awe and wonder and joy. I would just feel so lit up by all the beauty that was surrounding me and all the things that nature would show me. And it just made me feel really, really alive. And I became very much interested in how creativity and art, and more specifically photography, and linking that with nature can help us with our well-being more broadly. And during this time, I was in my late teens, of course, so I was still at secondary school. And in my final year of school, I studied psychology and philosophy. Up until this point, I'd been very interested in religious, moral, and philosophical studies. And still to this day, psychology and philosophy are things which are of great interest to me. And this will play in really well when we get on a little bit more to the book. But because I had all these interests in the mind and the perception of the world and these sorts of things, as well as the health and wellness remit because of my own journey, it really fueled me forwards on my own personal journey, but also with regards to where I ended up in my professional life. And when I left school at 18, I went on to university to train to be a nurse. And following qualification, I worked as a nurse for 3 years. But teetering on that decision to go and do nursing I was weighing it up between that or going to study psychology and becoming a counsellor and therapist. But of course, I chose nursing. But like I say, these interests have never left me. And especially in the last couple of years, I've begun to weave them more and more into my photography. And I have a YouTube channel where I quite often share how my photographic adventures out in nature help me to stay balanced in life, but also to share them with my philosophical thoughts. And like I say, all this will tie in very nicely with the book when we get onto that very, very shortly. As part of this journey that I was going through, when I was working as a nurse for the first few years, I began to go on a journey around Scotland. So I take my camera to all these incredible locations and photograph these beautiful scenes. And I think this is quite symbolic in some ways with regards to the journey of life. You know, we all go through life on this unique journey that we're all on, experiencing different things. And especially when we go away and we travel a little bit, we open up to different perspectives and perceptions. And of course, we see different places, which, from a psychology and philosophical perspective, really enabled me to broaden my horizons and, of course, photograph many beautiful places in the process. And then, of course, we hit the pandemic, which we're all very much aware of. And during that time, I wasn't allowed to travel. None of us were, of course. So I began to look more at the smaller details of life. And I also began to go on a much more deeper journey during this time, especially with regards to, I think, mental well-being and wellness. And I noticed that photographing these smaller aspects of nature took me into this little world, which got me out of my head and really allowed me to connect further with those emotions that I spoke about earlier and see the world from a completely different perspective, which resulted in my photography taking a different path. But it also enabled me to start seeing nature reflecting ideas and wisdom and lessons back to me, which I just thought was fascinating. And then being able to photograph these smaller aspects of nature, which many people walk past without even considering them, just opened me up to so many more opportunities, both photographically as well as in my life. But then I hit this time where I felt like I wanted deeper meaning in my photography. And for those of you who have done photography for many years, I'm sure you're aware, or any other creative endeavor, that you go through these peaks and troughs. So you have times when you're really inspired and you want to pursue what you're interested in and get really engaged with it. And then there's times where you begin to not maybe feel as much fulfillment from it anymore. And I hit this period towards the end of the pandemic where my love for photography was beginning to dwindle. And I felt like there was a much deeper meaning to my photography that I hadn't quite uncovered yet. And I entered this period of introspection, of even considering whether to continue with photography. And around that time, I was invited to attend the Creative Light Festival, which was a festival in the Scottish Highlands. This was in 2022, where I was invited to give a talk about my YouTube channel and the world of vlogging. So something I do alongside photography is create YouTube videos and obviously share them online. And I found also in my journey that doing video really helped me to find my voice, and especially when combining it with photography. So I was invited to this festival to give a talk about vlogging and how it can help people to find their voice. But what I didn't know at the time was that it wouldn't be delivering my talk that would have the biggest impact on me. It would actually be hearing the talk from a fellow photographer whose words wouldn't only motivate me to continue with photography, but they'd also completely change how I perceived the photographic world as a whole. And that photographer was Paul Sanders. He used to be a newspaper photographer, media photographer back in the day, and he now does very mindful photography where he goes out into nature and he really looks very closely at his surroundings and photographs the beauty of nature while weaving it in with often spiritual and philosophical and mindful approaches. So during his talk, he shared his journey into photography, but he also shared about the language of photography. And especially with his media background, he was very much aware of the impact that words and language can have on our perception on the world, and also the undertones of what certain words mean. And if we think about this with regards to the photography world, the words that we tend to use when we're photographing things is shoot, capture, take, and snap. So those are the four most commonly used phrases that we will hear when people are explaining their photographic process. And in recent years, more and more, we've seen some people start to say that they make their photographs or they create their photographs. But it's still very clear that shoot, capture, take, and on occasion snap are very, very common in the photographic world. And we say them often without even thinking about their meaning or what they represent. They've just become a part of the language of photography. And of course, all of them do reflect certain aspects of photography, but we can also think more deeply about what these words represent as a whole, and actually the real definitions and often emotions associated with some of these words. And we come to uncover that in certain situations, at least, and because we all perceive the world, to some people, these words can be quite challenging words, and they can also create some unease for some people. So Paul was kind of sharing his broad thoughts on this, and saying how since he started to adopt make and create into his photographic process, it's become more mindful, more intuitive. He's felt more connected with the world around him. And this fascinated me. And in that moment, it planted a seed in my mind, which I've not been able to stop thinking about since. And as a result, I began to explore this a lot more deeply in my own photographic practice. And I began to stop using the commonly used words shoot, capture, take, and snap. And I started to say make and create more. And of course, this took a little bit of practice because these words are so ingrained in our vocabulary and our minds. But what I noticed quite quickly was when I started to say make and especially create, that my images began to take on a whole new life. And going back to the emotion that I spoke about earlier in the presentation, more specifically, I noticed that my images began to appear more emotive. I was starting to create images with a lot of depth and meaning, and images which over the time that this was going on, I felt for the first time that I really loved my photographs. Because while I'd liked the number of images I'd created up until this point, I was throwing away a lot of photographs that I didn't really like. But by changing my language, I noticed that my approach began to change. And I just began to not only enjoy photography again, but also, like I say, create more emotive and meaningful images. And those who follow my work on YouTube began to notice this shift as well, which was really interesting. Before I wrote the book, I'd obviously been pondering what Paul had said and then seeing this change in my own photographic work. And I'd also been seeing it in some of my clients as well. But I then began the Photographic Connections podcast last year, and I interviewed a few people about their journeys. And some of the guests, namely a lady called Charlotte Bellamy, who does ICM, intentional camera movement photography, and a man called Stephen Hatch, who is a philosophical and spiritual photographer based in America. I spoke to them on the podcast a little bit about language, and Charlotte shared with me that in the Netherlands, where she currently lives, they generally say that they make their photographs rather than take their photographs. Whereas here in the UK and also in America and a couple of other countries, take, if we look at between take and create and make, take is a very, very commonly used word, and we don't hear make used quite as much. And I found it fascinating further thinking about this, how different languages in different countries use different words to describe their process. And then when I shared this further with Stephen as well, he shared with me how he's always seen himself as a maker of his images and how he makes his photographs in combination and in relationship with nature. So, by hearing some of the stories from others who had also contemplated language, it further propelled me to want to share more about this and also delve into it more deeply. And that's where the book writing journey began. For many years, I've wanted to be an author and write my own book. And there's a couple of book ideas that I initially came up with that will be books eventually, one of which I've started to work on already. But this book just seemed to be really pushing me because it had really helped to reignite my passion for photography, learning more about language and words, I noticed it was really helping other people in their journey. And it was also a kind of manual and a book that I could create in about 4 or 5 months rather than spending a long time writing a book, which is the case for some people and some authors who write books. And what I really wanted to do with From Shooting to Creating is to invite people to go on their own journey through the language of photography. So I can outline what I discovered in this process, but also different aspects of it. And they could then explore for themselves what each word and phrase meant to them. And I'll explain a little bit more in a minute what that entails and what I've included in the book, just to give you some things to ponder on your own photographic journey. So to begin with, the first thing I looked at when I was bringing the book together was the definitions of words. Now, each word has a various amounts of definitions, but if we look at the most commonly used times that these words are used, this is the most common times that I've listed on the screen here. So shoot, for instance, most commonly is used in conjunction with things like guns and violence, but it can also be used with regards to sport, which can be quite an exciting thing for some people. Capture is often used in conjunction with referring to imprisonment and confinement, but it can also be used with regards to like capturing our attention. So it can be exciting as well. And what I'm trying to do here is show that they have different meanings, both more positive meanings and negative meanings. But just looking at, like I say, the more used terms here and what they really represent. Take can often come from a sense of greed and lack, but you can also take something that you need, like taking a break. Snap is often associated with pain or sudden sound, but we can also use snap in a more playful way, like if we're snapping along to music. Make is often associated with producing or creating something, but we can also use the word make with regards to force, like making somebody or something do something. And create is most commonly used with regards to making or producing something. But we can also, of course, create negative things in the world as well. But when we look at the most frequently used reasonings and definitions behind these words, they're the ones on the left here, and the ones in brackets are the ones that are less used. So we can see when we look at things like shoot and capture, particularly, these can be quite challenging for some people. And then when we look further down at make and create, they can just be a bit more neutral or open. But this is all perception. We all perceive the world differently. And by looking at the definitions here, it just enables people to decide for themselves what these words mean to them, what these definitions represent to them, and how they basically feel about them. So going through the language of photography, this is the first stage that I invite people to go through, is looking at the literal definitions of each word. Of course, we are made up of so much more than just our minds and just the physical definitions of a word. And something that's of real interest to me is the energy behind words and language, as well as the energy behind everything in life. Because as physics shows us and teaches us, that everything in life is energy. So the same is therefore true, of course, for words and language. And when we look at the definitions of words and we then associate them with the energy behind those definitions, we can see that the language and the words begin to take on a whole new life of their own. And we can begin to delve into and view language and words, particularly, from a very different angle. And then bringing in, of course, the emotions behind this. Again, every word, it doesn't just have a definition, it also has the energy attached to it. And because of that, it has emotions attached to it, which, like I say, will be perceived differently by everybody. And one word, which might be a more uplifting word to some person, could be a more sadder and difficult word for another. But generally speaking, words tend to have a more generalized energy and emotion. And of course, emotion is energy in motion, which we'll go into a little bit more in a minute as well. And obviously, I didn't just want to look at language and just say, okay, this is the definition of each word. Every word has an emotion behind it. I also wanted to look deeper into this from a more scientific perspective, but also to understand it more from a psychological perspective. And just a couple of things that I looked into while I was researching for the book is things like positive affirmations, which is the idea that if you say something over and over again, something positive like, I am healthy, I am well, I am strong, that you begin to program your mind to believe it, and then it actually becomes your reality. I also looked at cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a form of therapy where we're kind of looking at people's behaviors and rewiring the minds as well. And I also looked at a thing called the map of consciousness, which was designed by Dr. David. I can't see it, sorry, the screen's in the way. Hawkins, I think his name is, which basically he looked, thank you, Steve. He looked at emotions and he did a number of tests where he could see that each emotion vibrated at a different frequency. This is where the energy comes into play here. So if you're feeling a certain emotion, so for instance, if you're in a state of joy or love or abundance, then the energy that's emitted through that emotion is much more higher vibrational than if you are, for instance, in emotions such as shame or guilt or fear. You'll then vibrate at a much lower frequency as well. So again, this is quite an interesting thing to interplay with words, because if words have energy attached to them and they also stir emotions within us, then if we're using certain words in our life, and here particularly our photographic practice, then we're also going to be feeling those energetic vibrations as part of that as well, which I thought was really, really fascinating. And something that's come to me since publishing the book is I've had somebody who works with neuro-linguistics get in touch with me, which is to do with language and how we learn language and integrate it into our minds, who's very fascinated in the book because of her work. And I've also had somebody who works as a hypnotherapist as well, and getting in touch to order the book because, again, they are interested in some of the concepts I explore in the book. So I just mentioned this here just to give you some background into some of the things I've looked into while I've been creating this book, just to get a little bit more of foundation behind it, and so that I can also understand further how language and words can actually impact our life. And being interested in health and wellness, this is quite an interesting avenue to go down as well. So if we go back to photography in particular, again, this is all subjective, but what I found in my research through my own experience, speaking to other people, as well as researching online, and even using AI as well to ask it what it thought of these things, I came to discover that there is some emotions that are most commonly associated with words. And if we think about the fact that each of these words therefore has this energetic frequency that I mentioned, if we're using them, we're going to be feeling the emotions associated with them, even if we're not consciously aware of it. So shoot, for instance, it can most frequently cause the emotions of fear, anxiety, excitement, thrill, and frustration within us. And as you can see there, there's much more positive emotions and some negative ones there. But ultimately, if you're using these words, you're not just going to embody one or two of these emotions. Generally speaking, the word will have it all within it. And I thought it was really interesting a few weeks ago when I shared some stuff about this on my YouTube channel. I received a comment from a veteran, just like yourselves, who told me that he really struggles when he hears people use the word shoot when they're describing their photography and how they approach their photography, of course, for obvious reasons. But I thought that was really interesting because he was saying, like I say, that he struggles to hear it used, but he also doesn't use it himself. And he would rather use some of the other terms, like take, for instance, which to him doesn't result in any negative emotions. But this is something that we don't always think about, depending on people's backgrounds and their experience, how a word like shoot can, for some people, be quite triggering. So it's always something to consider. The most commonly associated words connected with capture is fear again, as well as satisfaction and excitement, tension, curiosity. And I found it interesting. I did a kind of seminar last night online, and one of my clients said to me that as he's been reading the book, he thought that shoot was going to be the most difficult one for him, but he said that capture actually has brought up quite a lot of interesting emotions for him, and he's realizing that it's something that he doesn't want to use in his photography anymore, which I just thought was quite an interesting thing for him to discover for his own journey. Take is of course used a lot more broadly in the English language, so it's got more emotions associated with it. But take can often have the feelings of confidence as well as greed, selfishness, relief, gratitude, anticipation, envy, and jealousy. And the client last night who shared with me about his experience with capture, he told me that he had a conversation with a friend about the book and the language of photography. And his friend was saying to him that he finds take to be the most suitable word for his practice because he will ask permission of his subjects before he photographs them. So before he photographs them and takes an image of them, he's obviously asked for that permission, so he feels it's okay to take. And therefore, some of these emotions like greed and selfishness, envy and jealousy won't arise for him. And as you're hopefully seeing here, this is all very subjective. But what I'm doing with this book and with sharing this is just planting these seeds so that you can become more aware of these words and maybe what emotions and things and perceptions they bring up for you. And snap, of course, can be seen in relation to frustration or anger as we snap at things, but we can also get a snap of clarity. We can feel quite excitable or playful, especially if we're associating snap to do with snapping along to music. But snap can also result in anxiety, tension, shock, and alert, particularly if we're talking about it with regards to sudden sound or sudden pain or things like that. So it can be quite a challenging word for some people as well. And if we look at make, it can often have emotions associated with it, including satisfaction, empowerment, achievement, hope, responsibility, compassion, and generosity. But on the more negative side of things, it can also be used for control and manipulation as well. So again, showing the contrast and emotions that can come about through make. And lastly, we've got create, which can often result in a sense of inspiration, empowerment, fulfillment, excitement, a sense of freedom, curiosity, joy, and hope. So, as you can probably see here, for instance, as we've been going down these words and going from shoot down to create, generally speaking, the most commonly felt emotions that are used or felt when people use these words tend to become more higher vibrational words in the process. So by exploring this in the book itself and going through this journey, we can begin to uncover, like I say, what each word represents to us, what we feel by it. And what I hope in the end is that people will begin to see that create, for instance, can not only help us to become more of the creators of our images and feel more enjoyment when we're doing so, but it'll also lead to more of these more higher vibrational and perceived positive emotions as well. So the book, like I say, is really about inviting you to embark on your own journey through the language of photography. And I do this by enabling you to go on this unique experience. So I've shared with you this evening the kind of basics of the book in terms of how it goes into the definitions of the words and the emotions of the words. But what I do here is I'm not telling people that they should be using certain words and they shouldn't be using others, because as we contemplate this further, we see that every single word that's used in the photography world has a good representation often of what's happening. Like, depending on what genre of photography you enjoy, shoot and capture could be perceived as the best words to use to describe what you're photographing. For instance, if you photograph wildlife or sports, because you're photographing things at a very fast shutter speeds, and you've got a really fast, frame rate on your camera, then because of that fast motion and the fact that you're doing things very quickly, then words like snap, shoot, and capture can be very representative of what you're doing. But equally, if you're somebody who very much immerses yourself in the landscape, or you do things like macro photography or product photography, which maybe requires a more slower approach, then you may find that these words like snap and shoot aren't very representative of what you do. So, what I do in this book is I showcase all these different elements so that you can go on your own journey and, like I say, uncover for yourself which words are most suited to you. And it's also about encouraging you to be curious. Curiosity is something that is of much interest to me. In my own journey, I like to be curious about what I'm photographing, why I'm drawn to certain things, and curious about how words and language, if we look at this situation, are influencing not only the images I create, but my experience in the process of doing so. And I want to invite the reader to be curious as well as they explore each word and just contemplate, what does that word mean to me? How does it resonate with my photography? Does it resonate? Does it reflect? And actually, how is my experience when I go out and use these words? And to help people with this, the book includes a number of exercises. So we're all different. Some of us are very logical and practical and rational. Some of us are much more creative and imaginative. We all learn in different ways as well. Some people will read something and be able to take it in. Other people need to go out and physically do something to be able to learn about it. Some people learn more from reflecting on things, so they go away and they ponder things that they've been taught. Other people like to sit in their imagination and imagine things to learn them. And other people like to really feel things, feel if something's right for them, feel what they're creating. So, what I've done in this book is create all of these different exercises so that you can go on the journey holistically. So there's practical exercises in there where I invite you through a number of steps to go out and physically do photography under the different words and themes. There's reflection exercises, which is where I write a number of questions for you to go away and ponder them and then write down your thoughts regarding the questions. There's visualization exercises, which is a little bit like meditation, where you kind of sit and you visualize certain scenarios within your mind linked to the words and the emotions associated with them. And then there's embodiment exercises, which is all about getting into the body and feeling how the words, the emotions, the situations feel to you. And it enables the reader to decide whether they want to look at each word holistically by doing all of these exercises, or whether they choose the exercises that reflect their natural essence to explore them. So I really tried to make this book as inclusive and holistic as possible so that you can explore the word from all these different avenues. And I really feel, we live in a world where there's quite a lot of struggle. Many people have been through a lot in recent years, and obviously through various stages of their life. And we also live in a world where many of us can get quite caught up in the mind and in how we think and perceive things, and we don't always allow ourselves to feel. So if we look at the language of photography, for instance, if we just look at it from the mind's perspective, we can't then get into that feeling sense and uncover actually how these words are making us feel. So what I'm hoping to do with this book, as well as invite people to uncover how language could be affecting their photography, is also to enable them to get used to bringing the mind and body together to really start to not only feel what these words feel like to them in their practice, but also to implement some of these things into their life as well. So that I hope it will bring wellness benefits to people as well in the process. And something I really recommend as part of this is to do meditation practices, which is also in the book, just to allow people to sit down for 5 minutes and to quiet their mind and to begin to explore some of these concepts. And these 5 minute meditations are things which I've also been integrating into my work recently, because again, I feel it's really beneficial in exploring not just the language of photography, but exploring life and how we feel about things as well. So that's just a little bit really about the book, about my journey, why I went on to create the book, a little bit about how the book set out in terms of the holistic aspect of it all. And the exercises really are the most beneficial part of the book, I feel, because that's where you can go out and really practice these things for yourself and just ponder them. Especially if you're interested in psychology or philosophy like myself, then hopefully this book will be of interest to you. It is currently available as both a paperback and an ebook. And because the ebook was released just last week, I've got it on an early birds discount. So until this Sunday, it's currently $8.99 to download the ebook. I've got it as both a PDF version and an EPUB version. And after Sunday, it will be going back up to $10.99. So if you want to make the most of this offer while it's available, then like I say, that's up until Sunday. And as well as the book, if you want some free content, then I upload regularly onto my YouTube channel where I have various different styles of content there. Some are me going out with my camera and sharing my photographic journey with you, what I'm seeing, what I'm photographing, and how I'm photographing them, as well as some videos that are more about kind of the philosophical journey I'm on and the wellness side of getting into nature. I've also got the podcast, of course. I've not released any new episodes for a while, but if you'd like to learn about how photography has really helped people with their health and wellness, I have a number of guests on there. There's over 50 episodes where you can hear, firsthand how photography has changed people's lives, which can be really quite thought-provoking for you. And again, that's free. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and you can also find a direct link to on my website as well. And it's just called Photographic Connections. I'm about to start a new thing called Mindful Mondays. I did a trial last night with some of my clients, and it's going to be getting opened up more broadly to people soon. And it's a chance for us to meet on Mondays for an hour of meditation, mindfulness. I'll share some concepts about photography and the psychology and wellness aspect of it. And then the second half of the session is open to sharing from participants and questions. So if you'd like to learn more about connecting the mind and body and the wellness benefits of photography, that may be of interest to you. And finally, I also host in-person events. At the moment, I do immersive photography weekends up in Scotland, where I get a small group of people together for a weekend of mindful photography. And I'm planning to take photographic connections around the UK next year to do mini seminars where there'll be inspiring talks about photography and the chance to connect with people as well. So if you want to hear more about any of these offerings, if you just go on to photographicconnections.com and sign up to the newsletter, you'll be one of the first people to hear about it if it's of interest. So yeah, and my work's all about creating connection to self, nature, and other people. And something I've been saying a lot recently is photography brings us together so we can explore so much more. So yeah, and that's obviously what the book's about as well. So thank you so much for listening. I feel there's so much more I could have put into this presentation tonight, but I'm aware that there needs to be this space for questions from you guys. So thank you for listening. I hope it's given you some food for thoughts at the least. And yeah, maybe you'll be more thoughtful about the language you're using, not just in your photography, but your life as well as you progress forwards. Thank you.